Buenos días a todos, espero se encuentren bien. Bienvenidos a este primer programa Foodtech Scale que estamos iniciando hoy justamente. Gracias a todos los que se conectaron y gracias también a todos los que decidieron participar de este programa. La idea es que a través de esto que estamos haciendo tanto hoy como mañana, la intención que tenemos con todo este programa es crear el ecosistema Foodtech de la TAN y empezar a interconectar corporativos con startups, con scale-ups, con agencias también encargadas de desarrollar temas de alimentación, diversos organismos para la innovación, centros de investigación también con expertos de la industria y obviamente con fondos de inversión que decidan apostar por esta industria y desarrollar lo que consideramos puede ser el futuro de Latinoamérica en términos de alimentos, ¿sí? Para esto hemos invitado a diferentes expertos y panelistas que nos van a hablar sobre el futuro de los alimentos. Hoy vamos a tener a Nate Crosser, que es un especialista en temas de nuevas fuentes de alimentos. Ahora hablaré un poco más de él. Posteriormente tendremos a Jack Bobo, quien es un futurista que también nos va a hablar hoy acerca de las tendencias y el futuro de cómo nos alimentamos y cómo nos vamos a alimentar en el futuro. Mañana a las 10 de la mañana, hora de Bogotá y de Ciudad de México, 12 p.m. de Argentina y 5 p.m. de España, tendremos a David Suriol, que es un experto en ecosistemas digitales, y nos hablará también acerca de cómo crear ese tipo de ecosistemas en toda Latinoamérica y en el mundo incluso. Y mañana también yo tendré la oportunidad de conversar con ustedes y presentarles lo que es el futuro de la innovación a través de la innovación abierta, básicamente, y cómo las grandes compañías pueden acercarse a través de la investigación y desarrollo a traer diferentes oportunidades de negocio para sus empresas. Sin más, quiero introducir a Nate. Nate es un especialista en crecimiento de startups. Trabaja para el Good Food Institute, una organización sin fines de lucro, financiada por diversos donantes que están acelerando la industria alternativa de la proteína, todo lo que son carne, huevos y lácteos, principalmente derivados de plantas, cultivos y derivados de la fermentación. Nate ahí consulta con startups e inversionistas para capitalizar, comercializar y escalar nuevos productos y servicios, así como para construir herramientas para la industria de proteínas alternativas en general. Nate trabajó anteriormente en una incubadora universitaria de biotecnología y obtuvo un pregrado y un posgrado de la Universidad de Kansas. La charla de hoy trata sobre nuevas fuentes de alimentos, proteínas basadas en plantas, carne cultivada y fermentación. Sin más, quiero cederle el espacio entonces a Nate para que nos converse este tema y posteriormente le daré el espacio a Jack para que hable y tendremos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas donde espero que todos ustedes participen y nos hagan llegar sus preguntas y las dudas que tengan. Muchísimas gracias. Nate, please, if you can present.
Yes. Thank you, Luis. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. It is an honor to be able to present to you today. As Luis mentioned, my name is Nate Crosser, Startup Growth Specialist at the Good Food Institute, and I hope by the end of today's session, you will have a good sense of what the alternative protein industry is, its status, its current trajectory, and emerging opportunities. Here's an overview of what we'll cover over the next 45 minutes. First, I'll provide a brief introduction to the Good Food Institute and briefly why we focus on alternative proteins. Next, I'll provide a brief overview of the sub-industries of alternative proteins. Then we'll dive into plant-based food sales in both retail and food service, followed by an overview of emerging areas of innovation, including fermentation and cultivated meat. We'll then wrap up looking at investment trends. For those not yet familiar with our organization, the Good Food Institute is a nonprofit 501c3 organization that is dedicated to accelerating the shift to a sustainable, healthy, and just food system. We are funded by philanthropy, not the industry. Our organization employs over 90 staff around the globe with offices in 6 countries, including Brazil, with 3 key programmatic departments. In science and technology, our team of PhD scientists work to advance and open source the foundational science of alternative proteins. Our corporate engagement team builds relationships with the world's biggest food manufacturers, meat companies, restaurants, and retailers to help them capitalize on opportunities in alternative proteins. We also provide support to industry entrepreneurs and startups, as well as investors and financial institutions. We're happy to assist your company if you would like to get more involved in alternative proteins. All of GFI's resources and services are free of charge. Lastly, our policy team advocates for fair regulation of plant-based and cultivated meat and lobbies for government investment in sustainable protein R&D. The key question we are working to address is, how will we feed 10 billion people by 2050, and how do we do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely? Looking at our current food system, the use of intensive animal agriculture presents a number of high-level risks. For example, according to the United Nations FAO, intensive farming produces more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire global transportation sector. It is the #1 user of freshwater on the planet. It is the #1 cause of Amazon deforestation. It is the #1 user of medically important antibiotics. And recent research suggests that if this goes unchecked, widespread antibiotic resistance could cost the global health industry up to $100 trillion by 2050. There are other global health impacts as well, particularly in the area of foodborne illness and zoonotic diseases, and this can have an enormous impact as we're seeing now. One good example of this is swine flu and its impact on China's pork production. There have been over 145 reported outbreaks in China since 2018, and over half of the breeding pig population has died or been culled. As the graph on the left shows, as the pig population decreases, the price of pork goes up considerably. As you can see, this industry is really ripe for transformation with the significant impact these types of events can have on the food system. Additionally, as you probably have seen in the news, COVID-19 is ravaging U.S. slaughterhouses and meat processing facilities, leading to tens of thousands of sick workers as well as meat shortages. Despite all of this, demand for meat continues to grow with no signs of slowing. Driven not only by a growing population, but by rising incomes in many parts of the world. For example, as you can see here, demand for poultry is expected to increase by 120% by 2050. We can tell people to eat more plates of grains, beans, and greens, but this has been tried many times with little success. People love meat. That is why GFI is laser focused on the supply side of the alternative proteins industry. Our theory of change is that if you develop alternatives to meat, eggs, and dairy that are competitive in terms of taste, price, and availability, then the majority of consumers will shift to consuming those products. And we believe the way to do this is with alternative proteins, which we see fitting into these 3 categories. We can make proteins directly from plants, using animal cell culture, or using fermentation. I'll elaborate on all of these later. Ultimately, we may not see these 3 technologies as distinct industry segments, but rather as one large industry where we produce animal product alternatives across a spectrum, utilizing ingredients from one or more technology. Some fully plant-based, some fully cultivated or synthetic, and in the middle, we'll have a large and growing segment that are hybrids, using plant ingredients, ingredients from fermentation, and even cultivated ingredients. For example, the Impossible Burger, which is mostly plant-based but uses fermentation to produce hemoglobin, the signature ingredient that gives it the bloody appearance and meaty taste. And in the future, we might have a plant-based burger that uses cell-based or cultivated fat. First, I'll talk about plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy, the most developed category of alternative proteins. So, why now? Why all of this hype and focus when veggie products have been around for decades? Well, up until quite recently, when consumers thought of plant-based food, pictured hippies, sprouts, and unseasoned tofu, may have been what came to mind, what we'd call plant-based 1.0 or veggie. Products that were intended for consumers with a vegan or vegetarian lifestyle and don't always lead with taste. But today, plant-based looks very different. Plant-based 2.0 is driven by innovative, tasty products that are made to satisfy meat eaters. These products aren't being marketed to one specific lifestyle, and they are laser focused on competing on taste, the #1 driver of consumer choice. Central to Plant-Based 2.0 is the idea that meat doesn't have to come from an animal and dairy doesn't have to come from a cow. These next-generation companies are breaking meat down into its component parts and recreating each component from a plant source. Instead of cycling plants through animals to transform them into meat, why not make meat directly from plants? In effect, these new plant-based companies are revolutionizing the idea of what meat and dairy are. Along with this innovation, companies are no longer just targeting a small niche of vegans and vegetarians, which make up just about 6% of the US population. Instead, they are looking at both omnivores and flexitarians as their consumer market, which is a much larger market. On the left, you can see that 2/3 of US consumers reported that they are reducing their consumption of at least one type of meat, with the majority of those reducing red and processed meat. However, around a quarter are also reducing their consumption of either seafood or poultry. On the right, we see that 54% of consumers say they are trying to consume less animal-based foods and more plant-based foods. Many other studies confirm consumer desire to increase the consumption of plant-based foods. We are seeing similar trends in other parts of the world, with the United Kingdom and Germany also having high levels of animal meat reduction. Thinking about where this market is headed, it's important to note just how engaged millennials and Gen X are in the plant-based category. Millennials, who are poised to become the largest generation, plus Gen X together, drive 67% of volume sales of plant-based proteins. According to Mintel data, 79% of millennials eat meat alternatives, with 30% of them eating meat alternatives every day. Now let's briefly look at US retail sales. GFI's analysis of SPIN's data showed that in 2019, plant-based food sales reached $5 billion in US retail alone. To put this in perspective, the global chewing gum market is also approximately $5 billion. Unlike chewing gum, the market for plant-based food is growing at double-digit levels into a $1 trillion plus total addressable market for meat, eggs, and dairy. The dollar sales growth of plant-based food represents 11% growth from 2018. From 2017 to 2019, this growth was over 28%, up from $3.9 billion. Plant-based milk is the most developed category, and its history is a good sign for plant-based meat. Plant-based milk began to gain popularity in the early 2000s due to a mix of product innovation and a strategic change in merchandising. Indeed, the greatest factor in the growth of plant-based milk was probably selling it in traditional gable-top packaging alongside cow's milk in the refrigerated dairy section, as opposed to aseptic cartons in a specialty center of store section. In 2019, retail sales of plant-based milk reached $2 billion in the US, which equates to 14% of the total US retail milk market. Globally, plant-based milk sales reached $16 billion in 2018 and are projected to reach $38 billion by 2024. The second largest category is other plant-based dairy, which includes cheeses, butters, and yogurts, and grew at double digits to reach total sales of $1.4 billion in US retail in 2019. Plant-based meat is following the same trajectory as plant-based milk, with 18% dollar sales growth from 2018 to 2019 and a 38% increase from 2017 to 2019. Compared to conventional animal-based products during 2019, plant-based product categories have experienced remarkable growth, fueled by increased consumer interest and broader availability of ever-improving products. In fact, plant-based products grew faster than animal-based products across all tracked categories, including eggs, creamer, yogurt, cheese, butter, ice cream, and milk. In 2019, total US retail food sales grew just 2%. Plant-based foods grew 5 times faster, making them a key driver of retail sales growth. Because customers who buy plant-based food, on average, have larger basket sizes, making them a particularly sought-after customer by retailers. Even after the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States in early 2020, these trends held true. Plant-based meat, for example, has consistently outpaced the growth of animal-based meat as consumers both panic-bought staples as well as in the relatively calm period of socially distant shopping that has followed. Even more pronounced is the growth of fresh plant-based meats in 2020. That is, refrigerated plant-based meats typically sold alongside conventional meat, like Beyond Meat. In the 9-week period ending May 2, 2020, plant-based meat dollar sales growth was up 264% over the period the year before, whereas fresh animal-based meat grew at 45%. Plant-based meat currently represents only about 1% of total US retail meat sales, whereas plant-based milk represents 14% of total milk sales. Plant-based meat has the potential to reach the same level of market penetration or higher as sales of plant-based milk. If plant-based meat were to reach the same market share as plant-based milk, that would represent an over $11 billion growth opportunity in US retail alone. The top US retail brands in plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy category by dollar sales in 2019, pictured here, were a mix of legacy vegan brands, large corporate subsidiaries, and plant-based meat 2.0 companies selling a variety of products. Beyond these brands, there are waves of innovative new products coming down the pipeline. There are well over 300 startups in the plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy industry that GFI is tracking, and more forming weekly. There are companies in at least 28 countries. Approximately 210 are US-based, with 66 in California alone. This graphic provides a small sampling of these companies. Startups are able to innovate more rapidly and pursue more niche or riskier strategies than large corporations, and are thus the first innovators in nearly all categories. We are seeing the same pattern in emerging categories like eggs, ice cream, butter, seafood, chicken, pork, lamb, and other meats. Plant-based food is no longer limited to startups and legacy vegetarian brands. The big players in the meat and food industry have taken notice. Of the top 6 meat companies in the US, all of them are active in plant-based meat through their own product lines or investments. Turning to the largest food and beverage companies in the world, all of the top 5 have either invested in a plant-based brand or developed their own. On May 20th, 2020, Nestle announced that it is opening a $103 million plant-based meat factory in China. This is a massive shift that will boost sales growth in 2020 and beyond as these companies leverage their strength in distribution, manufacturing, and marketing. And of course, the opportunity is not just limited to retail. Food service typically accounts for close to 60% of dollars spent on food in the US, although that has obviously changed in recent months. And distribution of plant-based meat products absolutely exploded in 2019, as you can see here. Prior to 2019, plant-based burgers had been successfully launched at medium-sized chains like Carl's Jr. and Hardee's. However, US national rollout and the huge success that followed of the Impossible Whopper at Burger King raised the bar. In early 2020, the CEOs of both Taco Bell and McDonald's said that they would be adding plant-based meat to their menu. The success of plant-based and fast food has introduced many consumers to these products for the first time, and they are now looking for them at retail to prepare at home. According to NPD's Supply Track, U.S. wholesale revenues from plant-based meat shipments from broadline food service distributors to operators grew 37% to $224 million in 2019. We can extrapolate this figure to estimate a total U.S. plant-based meat food service market size of $1.68 billion in 2019. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has severely impacted the ability of the food service industry to serve customers. In China, however, where new cases of COVID have stemmed and restaurants have begun reopening, there has been a tremendous amount of activity in plant-based meat among large restaurant chains. In early 2020, KFC announced the launch of plant-based nuggets created by Cargill. Papa John's announced the launch of plant-based pizza toppings made by Chinese plant-based meat startup Starfield, and Starbucks announced the launch of Beyond Meat products across its 3,000 plus Chinese stores. Also, in the last couple of weeks, Yum Brands, which has KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell in China, announced that they would be test launching Beyond Burger and Beef Burger combos at their restaurants. Experts in China report that these developments are driven by a spike in consumer interest in plant-based food due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which originated in a meat market. GFI expects that both plant-based chicken and plant-based pork are likely to take off in the coming year. Further, there are many companies developing plant-based bacon, fish, lamb, beefsteak, and new cheeses, among many other products, which we expect to gain rapidly in popularity when available commercially. You can find more information on sales data at the links here. Now we will shift from product demand to product development. Pioneering innovators in the plant-based food industry like Silk, Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, Just, and Miyoko's have jump-started a virtuous cycle of product innovation, consumer acquisition, investment in scaled production. In addition to plant-based food consumption, which we just covered, and investment, which we will cover later, we have seen an incredible number of scientists, entrepreneurs, and corporations developing innovative plant-based ingredients, production methods, and marketing strategies. We'll examine some of those areas of innovation now. The first wave of plant-based foods were primarily comprised of soybeans and wheat, but the pioneers in the plant-based food 2.0 movement realized that there are tens of thousands of plant species that can be explored and optimized for their protein content and functionality. Beyond Meat's use of pea protein as a protein base, Impossible Foods' use of heme, and Just Inc.'s use of mung beans for its functional plant-based liquid eggs are a few examples of the magic that many companies are trying to emulate. There are many novel protein sources that show promise, including duckweed, chickpea, oat, quinoa, and hemp, as well as numerous oilseeds, pulses, cereals, and millets. Outside of the plant kingdom, trophic and trident algae innovations are unlocking red algae as a source of amino acids, coloration, and functionality for plant-based foods. Health is a key driver of consumer interest in plant-based food. In addition to metrics like calories, digestibility, and cholesterol levels, pronounceable, so-called, clean label ingredients have been key components of the perceived healthfulness of plant-based products. In addition to using ingredients with a health glow, like quinoa, there are many innovative approaches being taken to optimize label simplicity, such as Mycotechnology Corp., which produces a blend of pea and rice protein fermented with shiitake mycelium. Plant-based seafood remains an area ripe for innovation. Conventional wild-caught seafood is putting unmanageable stress on fish stocks, and aquacultured seafood faces many of the same problems as intensive animal agriculture, like disease. You can learn more at gfi.org/seafood. Despite seafood being a significant source of protein for much of the world and accounting for nearly 10% of dollar conventional meat sales in U.S. retail, there are only a small number of companies selling a handful of types of plant-based fish and invertebrates, accounting for about 1% of total U.S. plant-based meat retail sales. One notable recent event in plant-based seafood is 120-year-old seafood company Bumblebee, their distribution and warehousing joint venture with plant-based tuna startup Good Catch, announced in March 2020. Many of the blockbuster plant-based meat products to date have been ground or minced products like burgers, sausages, and nuggets, partially due to difficulty associated with imparting fibrous 3D structure to globular plant proteins. 3D printing has also emerged as a promising production method for 3D whole-cut meats like steak. Startups like Redefine Meat and Nova Meat are capitalizing on huge investments in 3D printing technology and collateral industries to create previously unimaginable generation of plant-based meat. Shear cell technology, a novel mechanical process that allows for layering of fibrous vegetable proteins, is now being commercialized by Rival Foods, a spin-out from public-private research partnership at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Some startups are eschewing mechanical processes altogether in favor of biological processes, such as solid-state fermentation, which is used by Atlas Food Co. to grow the architecture of whole cuts like bacon using aerial mycelium. Another company, Meaty with an I, is using liquid state fermentation to grow mycelium fibers that are then pressed together post-fermentation to create steaks, fish fillets, chicken, and more. Low moisture extrusion has been used for years to make restructured meat products like sausages, nuggets, and patties. New technologies have allowed producers to progress from these ground meat formats to pulled, shredded, and diced meats. Twin screw high moisture extrusion is currently the stalwart for creating these whole muscle products that best resemble muscle striata. In the last year, there have been significant research into both using new inputs like oilseeds and pulses is improving the extrusion machinery itself, which is leading to better, cheaper structured meat products. The popularity of plant-based food has often led to demand outpacing supply. In response, companies are developing manufacturing equipment, facilities, and processes that are built for scale and replicability. For example, Rebellious Foods is laser-focused on bringing down the cost of goods sold for their plant-based chicken nuggets and patties, which they'll sell in schools and retail locations in the Seattle region. We will discuss fermentation next. Fermentation, the use of microbes, often fungi or bacteria, has been used by humans for millennia, like turning cabbage into kimchi, soybeans into tempeh, and making cheese and alcohol. Fermentation has been used for many years in the food industry to produce ingredients such as enzymes, and in the biopharma industry to produce vaccines and drugs. The same technology is now being applied to the alternative protein industry and is showing a lot of promise in three key areas. First, using precision fermentation to impart nutrition, taste, and texture to plant-based foods such as tempeh. Second, to produce standalone protein sources and edible biomass. Corn pioneered the use of this use with its mycoprotein in the 1980s, and we have seen a wave of similar startups in the past year. Third, fermentation is used to produce functional ingredients for plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy, with the yeast-derived heme, flavorant, and colorant used by Impossible Foods as the paradigm. We're starting to see a lot of new entrants into the fermentation category. Within the biomass area on the left, you can look at products as either producing biomass as an ingredient, like Solar Foods or Air Protein, who are making protein out of CO2, or moving upwards on the chart, using fermented filamentous fungi to create structured meat-like texture in whole-cut products without extensive downstream processing. And then on the right, there are companies using fermentation to produce specific functional products such as dairy proteins, egg proteins, and gelatin, with the respective examples being Perfect Day, Clara Foods, and Geltor. Going back to the spectrum I showed earlier, you can now see where products with microbial fermentation may play a role along the entire alternative protein spectrum, including enzymes to improve functionality, ingredients to improve sensory characteristics, growth factors for cultivated meat, and 100% fermentation-derived ingredients to replace animal-based versions. One of the most striking opportunities of fermentation is the potential to convert agricultural and industrial byproducts into high-value human food-grade proteins. We expect that a lot of the growth in the alternative proteins industry that we'll see over the next 10 years will be a result of innovations in this category, both to produce standalone protein sources and to produce ingredients and enablers of other technologies. Now to cultivated meat, sometimes referred to as cultured meat, cell-based meat, or in vitro meat. In case this is new to you, I'll briefly introduce the concept of meat cultivation, which has its roots in biomedical tissue engineering and microbial fermentation. Cultivating meat is a form of cellular agriculture where we, to oversimplify, take animal cells, bathe them in a soup of nutrients as they grow in number, then harvest the meat. Cultivated meat can provide the same sensory and nutritional experience as conventional animal meat because it is comprised of the same cells. It is not imitation or synthetic meat, it is actual animal meat grown outside of an animal. At scale, it is produced in cultivators in much the same way beer is brewed or plants are grown from a cutting. You can learn more at GFI's Clean Meat Production 101 Primer, available on our website. By cultivating only the desired meat directly from cells, we can produce meat with fewer resources and significantly less environmental impact. For instance, compared with conventional beef, cultivated beef is estimated to reduce land use by more than 95%, climate change emissions by 74 to 87%, and nutrient pollution by 94%. Since cultivated meat is grown in a clean facility without the need for slaughter, it also effectively eliminates the risk of contamination by harmful pathogens such as Salmonella and E. coli. One of cultivated meat's most important advantages is that it does not require therapeutic antibiotics, thereby reducing the serious and growing public health threat posed by antibiotic resistance. Similar technology can be used to create cultivated leather, collagen, ivory, and other animal products, but we focus primarily on the primary product of animal agriculture, which is meat. Since the first cultivated meat companies formed in 2015, the competitive landscape has grown with increasing speed, nearly doubling in number of established startups every year. This graphic provides a non-exhaustive sampling of companies in the space. There are now over approximately 60 companies that appear to be primarily focused on cultivated meat production. Many more companies are pursuing cultivated meat as an additional business area. The industry is rapidly growing. More than 1/3, 20 total, of all cultivated meat companies were founded or left stealth mode in 2019 alone. Cultivated meat companies span 13 countries across 6 continents. Cultivated meat companies are developing at least 17 types of meat, including beef, chicken, pork, shrimp, lobster, crab, duck, whitefish, mouse, salmon, tuna, bison, lamb, fish maw, kangaroo, horse, and sturgeon. The concept of cultivated meat may seem like science fiction, but at least a dozen companies have demonstrated their ability to create cultivated meat. The question is a matter of if they can scale production, not whether they can build the technology. The majority of startups to date have set out to develop vertically integrated meat production platforms, which we have categorized as business to consumer or B2C. There are now 34 companies pursuing cultivated meat with a B2C strategy and 8 companies pursuing a vertically integrated strategy with cultivated seafood. The first cultivated meat and seafood companies to form predominantly took a B2C approach. However, as the industry matures, it has become apparent that perhaps even greater opportunities live upstream in the value chain. Equally abundant are opportunities downstream for production in food science, business services, safety, distribution, marketing, and food preparation. To draw an analogy to the gold rush, the most reliable way to profit was not prospecting for gold, but rather being the one selling the picks and shovels. In a future where a substantial portion of our meat supply is grown at the cellular level, the largest profit opportunities are likely not at retail, but along the supply chain. The huge opportunity for horizontal entry points by business-to-business startups is evidenced by the growing number of upstream suppliers. Of the 20 companies that launched in 2019, 13 were cultivated meat or seafood producers, but 7 were business-to-business B2B startups focused primarily on serving cultivated meat and seafood producers. There are now at least 15 companies serving the cultivated meat and seafood industry as a core of their business, with many more companies collaterally involved, including some of the largest life science companies in the world. It is worth noting that several companies are pursuing both B2B and B2C strategies simultaneously, and the lines are not always clear. The upstream business-to-business opportunities fit into 4 categories: cell line development, cell culture media, bioprocessing, and scaffolding. If you are interested, I can send you more information on the science of cultivated meat. I'll end briefly by talking about investments into alternative proteins. A wide range of notable investors are arriving at the same conclusion, that alternative proteins are a fundamentally better solution and a significant financial opportunity. Investors in alternative protein companies include Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Li Ka-shing, the richest man in Asia, Don Thompson, the former CEO of McDonald's, Jeff Bezos, Y Combinator, Google Ventures, Goldman Sachs, the US, Japan, EU, Israel, Singapore, and other governments, as well as many of the largest food, beverage, and meat companies in the world. We expect investment in plant-based food to become even more mainstream with the rapid expansion and the number of unique investors in the coming years. Investment in US-based or selling plant-based food companies, of which we have identified 143 in PitchBook, did not take off until about 1 decade ago. GFI estimates that $2.7 billion in venture capital has been invested in plant-based food from 1980 through Q1 2020. Over 99% of these venture dollars were invested between 2010 and Q1 2020. 45% of total investment was raised in 2019 and Q1 2020 alone. In 2019, venture investments reached approximately $457 million in U.S. plant-based food companies. Investment in U.S. plant-based meat, egg, and dairy companies in early 2020 was almost as much as 2019 full-year investment totals, with $741 million invested in the first quarter, even as COVID-19 has disrupted global markets. The bump was driven primarily by large investments in Impossible Foods and Clevia Farms. Now to cultivated meat. More than half of cultivated meat companies, at least 32 in total, have raised external venture capital funding. The top 10 most well-capitalized companies in cultivated meat and seafood are currently Memphis Meats, Blue Nalu, Future Meat Technologies, Wild Type, Meat Tech, Ayla Farms, Meatable, Integriculture, Mosa Meat, and Mission Barns. From February 2019, when Memphis Meats closed their $2.75 million seed round, through the end of 2020, cultivated meat companies received more than $166 million in disclosed venture capital investment. Nearly half of that investment, more than $77 million, was closed in 2019 alone. Although 2019 was in many ways historic for cultivated meat, Memphis Meat's Series B in early 2020 shattered the records. Initially announced at $161 million, Memphis Meats, which was the first company to demonstrate cultivated chicken and duck, ended up raising $186.25 million in an oversubscribed Series B fundraising round. The infusion of cash was greater than all publicly disclosed investment into cultivated meat industry previously. Investors included SoftBank, Temasek, and Norwest Venture Partners, a handful of famous CEOs, Tyson, and Cargill. Memphis Meats expects to use these funds to build a pilot production facility, continue to grow its team, and to hit a major milestone of launching products into the market. This round is not only a strong validating moment for Memphis Meats, but for the entire cultivated meat industry, and we expect investment to accelerate. Since the pioneering venture investors in the sector, including New Crop Capital, SOSV, Stray Dog Capital, and 50 Years began writing checks in 2016, total funding to the cultivated meat companies has roughly doubled every year. As you can see, despite COVID, and likely partially due to COVID, investment in alternative proteins spiked again in 2020. There is more investor interest now than ever for making meat, eggs, and dairy without animals, and it is apparent that the system must change. Using animals as meat-producing biomachines has become outdated. Just as kerosene replaced whale oil, automobiles replaced horses, microbes replaced cow stomachs for producing rennet and cheese production, animals are being replaced as meat, eggs, and dairy production technology. Not just because the end product can be made better, but also because the supply chains are much less volatile. The volatility of animal supply chains is now more apparent than ever, as COVID-19 has led to meat shortages in the United States, African swine fever is leading to pork shortages in China, avian flu is straining chicken and egg production, and farmers are forced to milk dairy cows just to dispose of the liquid. This is an opportunity for alternative protein companies to use their competitive advantages like ingredient storability to deliver taste, nutrition, and comfort to consumers while conventional meat companies cannot. For example, while major retailers in the United States have been limiting meat purchases and raising prices, Impossible Foods cut its price to distributors by 15% in March 2020 and increased its retail distribution 63% from 2,700 stores to 4,400 stores in May 2020. Despite major growth in sales, distribution, and investments, the total number and value of investments in plant-based food industry so far is relatively small. To put this into perspective, the $457 million in venture capital investments into U.S. plant-based food in 2019 are just 17% of the $2.65 billion in venture capital invested in U.S. cannabis companies alone in 2019. The plant-based food industry, as well as the cultivated meat and fermentation industries, are still very young from an investment standpoint, presenting ample opportunity for investors, entrepreneurs, and strategic partners to get involved at the early stages and capitalize on this global shift in protein production. Capturing even a fraction of the meat demand is a massive opportunity. If alternative proteins captured only 10% of the approximately $1.7 trillion global meat market, that would be $170 billion in annual revenue. Although plant-based foods have been around for hundreds of years, it was not until recently that innovation in the sector was really kickstarted by pioneers creating paradigm-shifting products and appealing to mainstream, and applying marketing strategies that appeal to mainstream consumers. Each of the past several years has seen accelerating innovation and investment, and 2019 was no exception. To track the developments in plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy, as well as cultivated meat, GFI created state-of-the-industry reports, which dive into sales data, technological advancements, investment trends, notable companies, the industry outlook, and other essential information for understanding the fundamental transformation occurring in the way that we make meat, eggs, and dairy. To download these reports, as well as our forthcoming fermentation report, visit gfi.org/industry. This concludes my presentation. Thank you all for your time, and I will now hand the mic back for Q&A.
Nate, thank you so much for having this presentation. I think it's very deep into knowledge on how the industry is transforming. I want to ask you a question before go with the question from the audience, but it seems that despite COVID-19, the industry is moving towards new sources of protein. how do you think is going to happen in the future? I mean, how COVID is going to accelerate or probably to slow the industry? Can you tell us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we've seen that COVID in the very short term slowed the industry a bit because kind of the tried and true method for launching a new plant-based product was food service channels, because you can control the culinary experience and the margins are a little bit better. But most of those companies have figured out other ways to launch. Another kind of speed bump has been the inability for companies to be doing lab work. But most of those like cultivated meat companies and fermentation companies that need to be in the lab are now back in the lab. And so the medium and long-term opportunities are better than ever. And we're seeing increased investor interest in the space. We're seeing increased consumption in the space. So we think that, it's becoming more apparent the vulnerabilities of animal agriculture, and governments especially are going to be more interested in funding this kind of research.
Good. I have another question from the audience is products, plant-based products. Beyond meat, do you have any other examples that you can share also?
Yes. There are, like I said, over 300 companies that have products in the plant-based sector. I can share my screen again and
okay, thank you.
Oh, and go to that list. But yeah, Beyond Meat is one of maybe it's one of the top 10 largest, but it doesn't really have a dominant position. There are lots of companies in the space, and actually GFI has a company database that tracks all of these companies. So if you're interested in looking at the full list, you can just go on our website and find that.
Perfect. Yeah, good. I have another question that is, what are the risks associated to cultivated meat?
The risks associated with cultivated meat from an investment perspective?
No, I think they are asking from the technical point of view. I mean,
yeah. So the main issue right now with cultivated meat is that it is really, really expensive to produce, and the primary cost driver, the primary variable cost driver of that is the cell culture media, which is basically like a broth of growth factors, vitamins, minerals, those kinds of things that are supposed to emulate the blood of an animal. And so that kind of technology has been around for years actually in the biopharma industry, but those products only need to be produced at a very small scale, and so they're very expensive. And so we basically need to rapidly scale up those kinds of bioprocesses so we can get huge amounts of cell culture media. So the main risk associated is that we can't do that at a reasonable enough price, but we're pretty confident that it's possible. And some of the largest life science companies in the world are now getting involved in creating cell culture media for cultivated meat.
Okay, excellent. Also, we have a question from Carlos Carazo from Florida. He's asking, what are the crops or plants most demanded but as inputs by the plant-based food industry?
Yeah, there's so pea has been extremely popular. Beyond Meat kind of pioneered the use of pea, and soy is still by far number one. It's incredibly versatile. It's incredibly nutritious. It can be grown cheaply, and it's grown across the world. So soy is by far the leader, but pea has really been emerging. The yellow field pea particularly, which is a lot of it is produced in Canada actually. Chickpea has been emerging. Companies are using hemp. Companies are using all kinds of like innovative products like microalgae, kelp. We actually on our website have a database of the different plant-based proteins that folks are using if you'd like to take a look.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, thank you. I have another question. One of the client's conditions is to guarantee good productive practices in vegetable crops. Has industries taken this into account?
Could you repeat the first half of the question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, one of the client's conditions is to guarantee good productive practices in vegetable crops. Has industries taken this into account?
Yeah, so like one issue, right, with producing a plant-based meat product, even if you're using soy or pea or something like that, is you're going to have multiple farmers, and there might be slight variances in the exact size or quality of the inputs that you're going to get. So those companies are putting in stringent sales requirements on those commodities that they're buying, and they're also just developing technologies like computer vision that are able to look at those inputs and verify that they're of correct quality for those purposes. Is that, or by good practices, maybe they mean like fair labor practices? And I would say most of the early companies in the space are very mission driven and care about that kind of stuff. So I would imagine that they are.
Sure. I have another question: is how is the appearance of the final product, meaning the color, basically?
Yes, they're constantly getting better. I mean, there are some companies that have cracked a beef product that looks almost identical to beef. Impossible Foods is one example, and I think what they've done is they've developed a heme additive, and basically heme is a shortened term for hemoglobin, which exists in the blood of all animals, and it also exists in plants. And what they've done is they've extracted that and they've added it to their meat, so it gives it the bloody color and the bloody flavor, and that's why they say it bleeds when you cook it. Impossible Food or Beyond Meat and others have used things like beet, but you could also use red algae, and there's all kinds of colorants that you can use. Color is not really a problem. Flavor is also not really a problem. Flavor is pretty easy to get right. The major roadblocks are texture, trying to get those really great whole cuts, and as well as just get the price down.
Okay, another question, Nate. I know that there are many companies here not only in Colombia but also in Latin America that might be interested in moving ahead into this new trend. For example, what do you think? I mean, for large companies, what is the best way to start testing this kind of new products or new technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we are basically rebuilding the food industry in a massive way. And so ultimately, every company that's involved in food can play some role here. And you should just start with what is your core competency as a company and find a way to leverage that. I wouldn't recommend, say you're a sugar mill, right? I wouldn't recommend planting peas. I would recommend finding a way to use your sugar within the industry. And so sugar, for example, is the major feedstock that is used in fermentation that feeds the yeast that creates the heme for Impossible Foods. So you can almost probably find some kind of application for what you're doing into the sector. And GFI is happy to talk to any company about what their niche may be. I highly recommend checking out the State of the Industry reports and just reading more on our website. Actually, in the next probably month or so, we're going to be releasing a large list of business opportunities that companies will also be able to check out.
Good, brilliant. No sé si dentro de la audiencia haya más preguntas que nos quieran hacer o alguna inquietud que le quieran comentar a Nate, aprovechando que lo tenemos aquí. Bueno, si no tenemos más preguntas, voy a agradecerle a Nate por su tiempo. Nate, thank you so much for your time and for, thank you for sharing your email. I think that's important. Thank you so much also for your time and your presentation. I think it's wonderful. For probably some of the people that just attended, is the first time they are listening to this kind of new trends that are appearing, and definitely I think it's going to change the mindset of many people. So thank you so much again. We will talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure joining.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.